One of the credentials I had for choosing someone to interview for this project was that I wanted to interview someone I could truly learn from. And as a music production major, I needed to hear from someone who was experienced in the music industry. The first person who came to my mind was J.R. Crisanda. Inspired and motivated by his father, J.R. picked up the clarinet at age 10. Once he learned to play the clarinet, he then picked up the saxophone. Upon graduating from Trenton State College with a major in music, J.R. performed across the country and even played in the prestigious Montreal Jazz Festival in 1988. Now J.R. is an admissions representative at Full Sail University. Given his musical experience in a variety of settings, I knew I could learn a great deal from J.R. and his experience in the music industry. And as I conversed with J.R. through email, I was not disappointed. Here's how the conversation went. The first question I asked J.R. was, what do you see as the role of the visual arts in society today, particularly in your profession? He answered, it has been said that people hear with their eyes. An example, unless you are an audio professional, including a musician, rarely will you ever hear someone say, that movie sounded great. Another example is the role that visual lighting and video plays in modern concert venues. Other than jazz or some electric music forums, concerts always pay close attention to making a visual statement. You could also argue that dancers and costuming are also visual art. Ever see a Cirque du Soleil show? Taken to its full extreme, a musician's look can also be considered visual art. I see visual art as playing a supportive role for the music industry, but they can be interchangeable depending on the emphasis given in each treatment. Music score and sound effects for a movie play a supportive role, yet video, lighting, costuming, and other visuals play a supportive role for a music concert. They call it production value, and depending on your POV, or point of view, for modern concert venues, it can either be supportive or take away from the production. The next question I asked JR was, new communications and media technologies make imagery almost instantly available. Do you believe that this is having a positive or a negative influence on your field or industry? And could you provide an example? JR replied, again, this is my point of view, and many would disagree for their own reasons. I have always viewed technology as something to be embraced, as a way to enhance my core talent. That's an important statement, because technology can easily become a detractor from one's core if you are not careful. As a woodwind musician, playing the clarinet, saxophone, flute, and electronic woodwind instrument, I took up synthesizers in the late 70s, which then led to using computers, hardware, software, and learning MIDI, and finally becoming a MIDI instructor here at Full Sail in the late 80s and early 90s. However, I never lost sight of my core talent, playing woodwind instruments, while using my newly acquired talents to embellish my musical offering. In other words, it made me more marketable. That said, though, some purists could argue that the time I spend developing those peripheral talents for technology stole valuable time away from further developing my core. I really can't answer that, but I'm glad I took the path that I've been on. Then I asked JR, what popular images do you see that are frequently repeated throughout your industry? He answered, well, this is due to my age, but it started out with psychedelic shapes in the early days for Led Zeppelin, The Doors, using projectors and lava lamps. Geez, I'm really dating myself here. Graduating later to artwork done by Peter Max and Heinz Edelman on Yellow Submarine, the film, but later applied to live concerts. Now we see the same process, just enhanced by technology with state-of-the-art lighting, programming, and staging. Rarely does one see a concert without this kind of production value. In fact, I have to search for artists that don't overuse it or don't at all. Just personal preference as a musician. The next question I asked JR was, who is one of your favorite visual artists? And what is your favorite style of visual art? He answered, that's a tough question because my definition of visual arts encompasses so many different forms: drawing, painting, sculpture, photography, video, film, and so on. Being functionally illiterate for many of the classic forms of visual art, I can really only call up my limited knowledge for what I have been exposed to. In addition, I think this is more directed at music, so I'll have to go with video film. In particular, filmmakers like Clint Eastwood, who's a fairly accomplished musician, and whose son, Kyle Eastwood, is an extremely accomplished musician, is one of my favorite artists. Most recently, he directed Jersey Boys, but also did my all-time favorite for Bird, a biographical film about Charlie Bird Parker. And finally, I asked JR, how has your knowledge of famous artworks influenced your creative process? He replied, any artist, regardless of their medium, is trying to tell a story, to give their interpretation for a thing, event, feeling, or something they hold dear enough to want to share. As a musician, this has always been my goal, to share something of myself with someone else that could make that person's life a little more enjoyable. What greater gift can one share?